In a world shaped by crisis, hope can be more than optimism. It can be a practice. Welcome to the Diaries of the Bertha Accelerator. This series brings together changemakers, advocates, storytellers, and organizers who came together in Istanbul at Postane, hosted in collaboration with Bertha Spaces and Bertha Foundation. Throughout the series, we ask how hope-based communication can help us imagine stories of possibility while staying grounded in reality, and explore how new narratives can be born in the midst of crisis. In this episode, storyteller, impact producer, and co-founder of Sunshine Cinema Sydelle Smith from South Africa, and documentary photographer, journalist, and feminist educator Greta Rico from Mexico explore how visual storytelling can confront inherited privilege, colonial histories, and the narratives we grow up with. They reflect on the responsibility of storytellers to examine their own positionality, the enduring legacies of settler colonialism, and the ways communities, whether in South Africa, Mexico, Australia, or the United States, continue to resist, heal, and reclaim their stories.
Well, hello.
Hi there.
Sydelle, how are you? Welcome to our podcast.
Welcome to our podcast, Greta.
So our podcast will be about
visual storytelling and activism, I believe.
Great. So we are here at Postane in Istanbul, and we are very grateful for this space and also for all the foundations that make this possible in this Bertha Accelerator. So would you like to start by introducing yourself?
My name is Sydelle Smith, and I'm a photographer and filmmaker from Johannesburg in South Africa. And I work in documentary photography, and I also am the co-founder of a solar-powered mobile cinema network called Sunshine Cinema, using film for impact distribution. And I'm a mom, and I love being here with all of these incredible, inspiring activists. How about you?
Well, my name is Greta Rico. I am a Mexican documentary photographer. I am also a journalist and a feminist educator.
Wonderful.
So why don't we start talking about your project? It was very, very, it made me ask a lot of questions to myself, to our identities, and also to the different contexts where we are working. So your project is about whiteness. Tell us more about it.
So the project that I came here with is a personal project called Unsettled. It started as a documentary photography project in about 2015, and it has developed into a documentary film. And it comes from the space of being a white South African growing up in the new South Africa. I started school the year that apartheid ended. And we were really told that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had done the work, that we didn't really need to look at ourselves necessarily. We were now the Rainbow Nation, and we were this place of collective healing because we avoided a civil war, and we now had this new country and this new president. But 30 years later, the reality on the ground is very different. A lot hasn't changed. A lot of the land and the wealth and the power still remains in the hands of white people. So that inspired me as a photographer who'd been working across the continent in the more traditional sense of being hired by news outlets and editorials and NGOs telling stories about other people, to turn the lens on myself and the people around me, and to really look at what does that inherited privilege look like and what can you do about it to be a bit more accountable and a bit more reflective if you are someone who comes from a country that has a history of settler colonialism. As a settler, I think it also comes from being Jewish, having that interest in that, because it links quite strongly to what's happening in Gaza and Palestine and Israel at the moment. So the project evolved into a long-term documentary, which I'm working on, where I ask of people of European descent in countries that have histories of settler colonialism, how do you feel about this inherited privilege? Do you see it? Do you acknowledge it? What could we be doing to be better ancestors for the future?
So while I was looking at your project, it was very interesting to me also to think about whiteness as a situated experience. And I wanted to ask you, I'm very curious about, are those experiences related? Are they the same? What are the intersections in the different countries that you are working?
So one of the bigger intersections that needs to be explored more in the documentary is around the origins of the structural racism in those countries. So segregationist laws, for example, from Western Australia were used as a template for the apartheid laws in South Africa, which were then in conversation with the Jim Crow segregationist laws in the United States. So the founding of those racist structures were shared in many ways. And I think if we go further back, these ideas of empire and people thinking that a place is devoid of civilization, that you can come to a new land and declare it yours as Christopher Columbus, or you can come to a new land and declare it yours in Australia with Terra Nullius. This view of our Western ways of thinking and doing are somehow more evolved and somehow more civilized than others, so that that kind of mentality has definitely been bred into the way people think a lot of the time, I think. And I think it shows up a lot in development. It shows up a lot in photography. It shows up in all different types of industries, because I don't think we've really unpacked that othering that we started with. Because in order to have whiteness, you have to create blackness. In order to have civilized, you have to have primitive. There always has to be this dichotomy between the two. So those similarities were definitely present in the different places. But I think the biggest difference with South Africa is that white people are a minority of the population, even though there's still a lot of power and privilege and wealth in that minority group. So you're almost forced to confront it maybe a bit more head on. It's a part of the national conversation all the time. Racism, healing, restorative justice. It's almost part of our culture as a country. But when I've gone to the parts of the United States where I've worked, or the parts of Australia where I've worked, there's a huge amount of denial about that. This idea that, colonialism wasn't bad, that, oh, well, there was no one here before, so it was okay what we did in Australia. You can't change history, so why look at the past? So that erasure and similarity in the United States and Australia was quite dominant, moving around the two different countries. And I think that listening to people from Australia now, there's definitely a playbook that they're taking from when it comes to how they're trying to erase the way in which people want history to be more reflective, more decolonized, more inclusive. They're taking that playbook from what's happening in the United States when it comes to changing words for slavery, banning books, all of those kinds of suppression. So if people weren't it feels like they're so ashamed of it that they would rather just hide it and shove it under the rug, so to speak. But those ghosts are coming back now to haunt the society, because I don't think, and you can't really heal if you don't really look at your wounds. And South Africa, as much as we've looked at our wounds and had our healing process, the economic transition, the transfer hasn't happened.
And I'm also curious about, well, you've already mentioned this dichotomy between Black people and white people, and also all the difference that history has made us believe, and society and culture. But I'm also curious about different white people. If you found any interesting reflections in terms of, maybe it's not the same being white from for example, if you have the opportunity to go to university, to do a master, to do a PhD, or maybe white people that work in a farm, I'm just also thinking about the intersections between certain population in particular, and if the way of thinking is different, or is it more interesting? I don't know. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think it really depends on how you're living in society. If you're living in a more diverse space with people of different cultural backgrounds, but you're all on the same kind of economic playing field, I feel like there's more chance in some instances for real diversity to be happening. But then at the same time, there's also more divide. So if you look at who was voting for Trump in the recent elections, a lot of those people are working class white Americans who are biting down on that narrative of fearing the other who's coming to take their jobs. In South Africa, we do have poorer white people in some instances, but if you were to go back in their history of how their grandfathers first got jobs, how they first got any kind of land in the country, it was linked to the apartheid government, which is largely how they garnered so many votes, as they promised working class people, you're going to work for the railroad, you're going to work in the state services, you're going to be the policemen, the civil servants, and that is what happened in the country. So even if you're economically poorer, you had an unfair starting block in a way, if that makes sense. So you still came with a lot more social capital in the dynamic. So for a poorer white person culturally in South Africa, if you are someone who goes to university, for example, you're not going to be expected to then use the salary that you get to pay for 10 of your cousins' school fees and shoes and all of the other things. But in a black family, it's part of your culture that you would then look after the next generation of people. But that also comes with huge economic stress. Yeah.
Very interesting.
But complicated.
Yes.
And I think also to say in Australia, what's very complicated, I don't know how familiar you are with the stolen generation, but during the colonial era in Australia, they stole Indigenous children and they brought them up in white families and essentially tried to erase their indigeneity. So it can be quite confusing in Australia because you can meet someone who looks like a white person, but when you're talking to them, actually they are of Indigenous heritage based on what the country was doing with the stolen generation. So that racial construct is a lot more blurred.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, still happening in some governments around the world.
Yes.
So also because of that, I think it's super necessary to keep talking about these topics. And I think that your project is super interesting. So thank you very much for sharing it. And can you please also share with the audience where can we check your work?
Yes, thank you so much. So the project is in production. It is called Un/Settled, but you can look at my work on Instagram at Sydelle Willow Smith, and then our solar-powered mobile cinema distribution network is called Sunshine Cinema.
Great.
Thank you. I have some questions for you, if you don't mind.
No, please.
So I don't have a huge understanding of Mexican society, but from afar it seems that there is a very strong culture of activism, of movement building, of working class people garnering together to rise up and fight for their rights. But then at the same time, there seems to be a lot of issues around Indigenous people not accessing their rights. Can you give me a little bit of context of what it's like to work in that kind of context with regards to the project that you're doing about food sovereignty?
Yes. Well, I think first of all, I think it would be very important to also link the projects that we are working, and mine is also about colonialism as well, in terms of how whenever colonialism happened in my continent, in the American continent, but particularly in Mexico, they started taking off the culture, the traditions, as it happens everywhere, but mainly our food sovereignty and also being very proud of what we eat, how we mix ingredients, food, and also how we, with these traditional and ancestral methods of agriculture that we are still using in Mexico, we can create a very nutritious diet for the people in my territory. So it is very interesting because nowadays in big cities like Mexico City, as you may know, there's 20 million people living in that monster city. And I actually started the project beginning to realize that people in the city is super disconnected from the countryside. We do not know where our food comes from. We do not know how to grow anything. And because of that, we also do not understand the value of taking care of the countryside and also of taking care of the seeds, of taking care of all this ancestral knowledge that indigenous and rural communities have in Mexico. So the purpose, and one of the main purposes of my project is to actually give value to that work and to recognize that our small farmers, the people that are actually feeding the country, which is not the language that the government, for example, is using, and of course is not the language that the corporations are using in order to privatize the food and the seeds that our grandfathers and grandmothers have been taking care of. And also I realized during this interesting and loving path of walking with small farmers' families in the countryside, I realized that it was also colonization that was taking away from us the proud of being a territory where you can eat from native seeds, and also to realize the diverse variety of different species that we have, and the importance of taking care of those seeds in order to face, for example, climate change, but also to face the devastation of the ecosystems that a lot of the corporations are doing in the indigenous territories in Mexico.
And is it, I imagine having such a big, powerful, I don't want to say monster, but big, powerful global power right next door to you. Is the United States buying up land, like corporations from the United States buying up independently owned land in rural Mexico that is now making it very difficult for the farmers to even retain land because they can't afford the property taxes or things like that? How are they losing their land?
That's a very interesting question, because actually, as you were saying, when you started to talking about this project, in Mexico, we do have a history of fighting for land, fighting for our rights. And Mexico is one of the countries in the world that we still have a social ownership of the land. So corporations cannot buy land in Mexico. There is no way they can do that, because a lot of indigenous and rural communities are still ruled by their own laws. And the social ownership still exists. So this is actually also interesting, because at the end of the day, this has been a very strong argument for people to keep fighting for their seats and to keep fighting for their own traditions and their own methods to care for the land and to grow food. You know, the basis of food sovereignty around the world is for farmers to own the land, for the people who have been taking care of all that knowledge to own the place where they work. And this also has to be part of our hope, that they still own the land, that they are still, and it is also very interesting, because in some of those communities, private property does not exist. This land is for all our people, for all the people that lives here, and also for the generations to come.
It's so interesting, because I think a lot of the people that I have been interviewing for my project who come from an indigenous heritage or are fighting racism and things like that, what it boils down to, it feels like a lot of the time, is if we were to take a more indigenous lens on land as not just being the ground, but also the sky and what's under the land, and that the land is part of you and you are part of the land, that land back kind of movement could be such a beautiful response to this continuation of racial capitalism, whereby you need cheap labor in a place, you need to be able to exploit people in that place to make a profit. It doesn't matter if you're doing monocrop farming because it's for your profits in this year. It doesn't matter if the person 10 years from now can't grow anything in that place because your GMO seeds have killed the ability to do anything like that. So I feel like if we were all to just take a little bit of that learning of, you know, that Mother Nature is our mother and is looking after us, but we also need to be looking after her, we would be in a much better place as a world when it comes to the climate. But yet these corporations and the ones who are only interested in profit don't seem to want to look at the long term.
Yes, exactly. And that's actually some of the things that I'm also working in my project to make people realize that corporations are not working for people. That one of the biggest lies that we've ever been told is that corporations are feeding the world. And that is not true. The statistics are already there. And the ones that are feeding the world are small farmers all around the place, not only in Mexico, but also in other countries, mainly because corporations are only planting seeds that are profitable. Seeds, they are only planting food that you can sell. And what small farmers are doing are actually planting food for all the community. They are planting food in order to take care of the seeds. The best way to take care of seeds is to actually keep planting them, so the varieties can be adapting to the changes of the climate in the future. And instead of that, what corporations and also governments are telling us is that the best way to keep seeds is in a fridge. So the reality is that they are doing that in order to profit with those seeds, because it doesn't matter if you have them in a fridge for 10 or 15 years. If the soil is not in good conditions, if the climate is actually devastating the ecosystem, there will not be any place so we can plant that seeds. So that's why it is very important the work that these families and small farmers are doing. And I am also documenting the efforts of how they are locally organizing in order, for example, to create seed houses where they can store their seeds, where they can interchange in a very free and in a very free and autonomous way, not only the seeds, but also the knowledge of how to plant that seed, how to adapt that seed, but also how to mix crops. Because another thing that corporations are doing as well is to make us believe that crops are only of one species. Like we are able to see, like in movies, in pictures, or also in their commercials, like a very, very, very massive crop of only maize, only corn, transgenic corn to be more particular. But in Mexico, what they do is that they create milpa, which is a polycrop where you can find more than 200 different varieties of food. So you can mix it, and so you can get a very nutritious diet. So this imaginary of the countryside by planting only one thing, only potatoes, only corn, only grapes, only apples, is not the landscape that we used to see in the ancient times. In the ancient times, people were thinking about a whole diet from a piece of land. So they were planting so many different varieties. And this is what my project is also about, that we need to go back. You know, sometimes when we talk about climate change, when we talk about food sovereignty, when we talk about free ourselves from what corporations are trying to rule in different countries, we are always thinking about what can we create, how can we think of new ways of doing this and that. And this project is about reclaiming what already exists, which is traditional and ancestral knowledge of doing milpa, of growing food, and go back to what we already know that works, you know?
It's such important work, and I hope that there would be various strands of support for something like that in a country like Mexico that's so famous for its food and for its activism. Do you see more chefs and more supermarkets and more people in the urban centers supporting? We would call this like a decolonial approach to agroecology, for example, in Africa. Do you see that support coming through, or is there still this big separation between like the peasants in the rural areas and the urbanists who want to be able to buy McDonald's and not be questioned about what they're eating?
Well, this is also a very interesting dialogue because, yes, chefs are also trying to recover like ancestral recipes and traditional food. But in my particular opinion, what's also happening with that recovery, which is not the same as reclaim, is that they are creating spaces where traditional food is super expensive. So local people can see it as a luxury. And in my particular opinion, it's not the way that we need to go, because at the end of the day, food, it's a matter of social justice. And every person in my country should be able to buy local food, should be able to buy agroecological products that come from the traditional milpas in Mexico. And it is our right to be able to access those products. So whenever like chefs start like gourmetizing traditional Mexican food, what happens is that it becomes a luxury, and we need to also fight against that.
Definitely. And I think, I don't know what the history of how colonialism was built up as an urban system in Mexico. But for example, in many African countries, the state was defined by, this is where we need to get the resources out from. So we need to build a big city here because we know that we can get the gold quickly to this port and get it through there. So that urban-rural divide is very present in many of the countries in Southern Africa where we work. And I'm wondering, how do we then use something like visuals and visual activism in this age of noise and the attention economy? How do we get people to care more?
Well, this is a question that I think all of us are questioning all the time to ourselves. And well, I think for me, it has been very simple at some point, because it's only a matter of me thinking and reflecting about everything that I don't know as a woman from the city. So that's actually how I started the project. I started from my own ignorance about the countryside. I didn't know how to grow food. I didn't know where the food that I eat comes from. So I started exploring that, and I started showing the people in my city all these new findings that I was having, and also realizing that, well, even though Mexico City is the second biggest in Latin America, the reality is that half of the territory of the city are conservation areas where it is mandatory to keep growing food. And also because of the legal system that we have in the city, you cannot grow GMO seeds and it is not allowed to use pesticides. So my project is also about telling the people in the city that we can bet for short distribution food change in order to support small farmers that are doing all this massive effort to, again, conserve the traditional agriculture, but also to care about the seeds that will make us sovereign, that are making us sovereign now, that had made us sovereign in the past, and that will make us sovereign in the future as well. And yes, it's about showing what we don't know, what, again, corporations and government has made us believe that no longer exists.
I think it's amazing, though. It sounds quite progressive, that idea that you can't grow GMO and you can't use pesticides coming from the government, because that's not the case in our country, for example. So that's really great to hear that that indigeneity philosophy is coming through in an official capacity. I think one of the biggest struggles in South Africa is that land hasn't been given back to people. So most people don't even own a piece of land to be able to be doing subsistence farming, because their land was taken and then they were forced to be miners on the gold mines and things like that in the urban areas. So there's that huge disconnect. And I think food will be the next world war. So I think it's very important, the work that you're doing.
And something very interesting about this, Sydelle, is that, yes, it comes from the government, but we also need to reclaim that this was a fight that was weighing from the civil society, from the indigenous and rural communities, and also to remind the government itself that they've never given us anything, that this was a fight. And actually, it's very interesting that you say this, because this year, a new law was approved in the Mexican Senate, where it is now a constitutional mandate to protect native maize seeds in Mexico, and also to ban GMO maize seeds in Mexico, and also the pesticide that actually grows GMO seed, which is glyphosate. And this was also a win from civil society and from the rural, peasant, and indigenous communities and organizations that has been fighting since forever for the right of food sovereignty for all the Mexican people.
It's very inspiring in that sense. And the context in South Africa is so different, because a lot of the farmers are white farmers, and those are the people who a lot being recently granted refugee status in the United States. But it's monocrop farming, it's mass scale farming. And when you speak to subsistence farmers, they can't get their produce into the supermarkets, because the supermarkets want such a huge scale of X carat that's going to last forever on the shelves. So they can't actually sell their food on a mass scale. So then they don't see the economic value in focusing on farming. And a lot of young people don't even want to get into farming.
Exactly. Yes, and this is also something interesting, because what I'm also doing with the project now that I'm working on, for example, exhibitions, and also giving conferences and talks and workshops, is that I'm actually educating people in Mexico City where to find these farmers. Because when I started conversations with these families, they told me that one of their biggest struggle was to sell their products, because people were not coming to them. So now what we are doing together as a common effort is to tell people where you can find them, tell people that you need to buy from them instead of going to the supermarket and to all these big brands that come actually from the US. So it's better to prefer local food from local farmers, from your people that are actually working for a common good, that is food sovereignty, and also the local seeds. Well, it was a great conversation, Sydelle. Thank you very much for sharing. I think it was very interesting also to find links between the work that we are doing, and also it's super enriching to hear about some other projects and how can we intersect the conversation.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I learned a lot about how Indigenous voices can actually change systems. And I hope that the Mexican government sticks to their word about the GMO
Hopefully.
and the pesticides. I guess, lastly, if you were to think about visual storytelling and activism, what would be your biggest hope for an audience member looking at the work? What would be one action that you would want audiences to take after experiencing your project?
I think that the biggest action that I'm hopeful to get is for people to remind themselves that hope is within these families, that hope is within local action, and also to reclaim like civil society power to take informed decisions. I think that sometimes we as storytellers, as photographers, as journalists, sometimes forget that people do want to know the truth, but this truth do not necessarily has to be catastrophic. You know, the truth is that there is hope in small farmers and we need to support them with everything we can. What about you?
So I think racism makes us all sick. I don't think that it's good for anyone, even if you're benefiting from it. I think deep down it's not good for your soul. And I think that we have come from many societies where we've been kept apart for so long. And my hope would be that through having more vulnerable, more reflective conversations that are not just about looking at your own shame and your own past in a way that leaves you not feeling like you can do anything with that information, that it would inspire you to ask more honest questions of your family, of yourself, of how you came to be in a particular position. And hopefully that would then instill in you a sense of passing on to the next generation more humility, more respect, more openness to other ways of knowing and doing things, and breaking down this idea that Western values must always be the golden standard and the golden measure of progress. I think we would be better off. I think there would be more excellence at the table from all different types of excellences. And it would essentially lead us to be better ancestors. And
as it should be.
Yes, big goals.
That was beautiful. Thank you very much for sharing, and thanks for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Postane.
Bye.
Bye.
This episode was made possible by contributions from the Bertha Foundation and the UMI Fund.